The cold metal of the restraints bit into Nyx Veyne's wrists as she was dragged through the human war camp, her captors silent but watchful. The flickering glow of the campfires cast shifting shadows across her violet skin, bruised and marred with dust from battle. Around her, human soldiers stood in clusters, some with wary eyes, others smirking as they whispered among themselves. She refused to falter. Her people, the Dominion, had drilled it into her from childhood. Weakness was death. The moment you lowered your gaze, the moment you let them see your pain, you had already lost. So she walked tall, shoulders squared, despite the ache in her limbs. Beyond the rows of crude tents, at the heart of the camp, Captain Dain Rhoan awaited. He stood apart from the others, his scarred battle armor streaked with dried blood and dust, his expression unreadable. Nyx had seen his face before, on intercepted transmissions, on the shattered hulls of Dominion warships after his fleet had torn through them like a wildfire. He was a commander unlike the humans she had been taught to despise, calculated, relentless. And now, he was the man who had captured her. One of the officers flanking him grinned as she was shoved forward. "High-value prize," he said, gesturing at her like a trophy. "Straight from the Dominion's command ship. General's orders, she's yours now, Captain." Nyx's breath tightened. "Yours." The word twisted in her mind, thick with implications. She lifted her chin, meeting Rhoan's gaze, expecting mockery, perhaps cruelty. Instead, she found something else, an assessment. Cold. Measuring. She drew in a steady breath. "Nyx Veyne," she said, her voice unwavering. "Daughter of High Strategos Veyne. Second heir to the Dominion throne. If you expect me to kneel, Captain, you will be disappointed." A low chuckle came from the officer beside Rhoan. "Fiery one. Eh? Maybe she just needs the right training." Nyx barely had time to register the crack of bone before Rhoan's fist connected with the man's jaw. The officer stumbled back, blood dribbling from his split lip. The camp fell silent. "Speak like that again," Rhoan said, his voice low and edged with steel, "and you won't be standing to apologize." The officer stiffened, then nodded before slinking away. Nyx's pulse quickened, not in fear, but in curiosity. This man was not what she had expected. Rhoan turned back to her. "Take the chains off." The guards hesitated. "Now." The metal restraints fell away with sharp clicks, clattering to the dirt. Nyx flexed her fingers, feeling the weight of her captivity fade, though the phantom of it lingered. "You're not afraid I'll kill you?" she asked, tilting her head. Rhoan smirked. "You should." Her eyes narrowed. "And yet, you removed my chains. Because I don't need them to keep you here." Something cold and strange coiled in her stomach. Not quite fear. Not quite understanding. But she knew then, this man was dangerous in ways she had not anticipated. The first explosion shattered the night. Nyx had been standing beside Rhoan in the human convoy, arms crossed, when the sky ignited. Fire tore through the lead vehicle, sending metal and bodies flying. The air filled with the screams of dying men and the sharp crack of plasma weapons. Dominion rebels. For a single heartbeat, Nyx froze. These were her people. They had come for her. Then instinct took over. She dove behind the wreckage of a transport as plasma bolts cut through the night. A second later, Rhoan dropped beside her, rifle raised, smoke clinging to him. "Friends of yours?" he asked, voice tight. She exhaled sharply. "Not anymore." A Dominion soldier lunged toward them, blade humming with lethal energy. Rhoan fired, and the body dropped. Another figure charged from the side, a warrior with silvered skin like her own. Their eyes met. Recognition flickered. He hesitated. A fatal mistake. Nyx moved first. With a sharp twist, she wrenched the weapon from his grip, flipping him over her shoulder and slamming him into the dirt. He groaned, dazed. Rhoan eyed her warily. "I don't suppose you're about to switch sides?" Nyx twirled the captured blade in her grip, testing its weight. "If I was, you'd already be dead." A beat of silence. Then, to her surprise, Rhoan nodded. "Fair point." The battle raged around them, but as they fought, something shifted. They moved in sync, covering each other, anticipating attacks before they came. It shouldn't have been possible. Yet when she cut down a rebel aiming for Rhoan's back, she did it without hesitation. When he shot a sniper before they could target her, he did the same. By the time they reached the high ridge overlooking the battlefield, the Dominion rebels had pushed too far, too fast. The humans were being overwhelmed. Nyx scanned the battlefield, mind working fast. "I can stop this." She turned to Rhoan. "They don't know I've turned against them. If I walk into their line, they'll hesitate, just long enough for your men to regroup." His jaw clenched. "That's suicide." She smirked. "No. It's strategy." A long beat. Conflict flickered in his storm-gray eyes. Then, at last, he exhaled. "Don't get yourself killed," he muttered. She didn't answer. She was already moving. As she stepped into the open, Dominion soldiers faltered. Their weapons lowered. Confusion flickered across their faces. "We came to free you," one of them called. Nyx gripped her stolen blade tighter. "Then leave. Because I am not your prisoner." Murmurs rippled through their ranks. Doubt crept into their faces. Behind her, Rhoan's forces moved, positioning themselves. Waiting. She had seconds. "I fought beside you once," she called out, her voice carrying over the battlefield. "I bled for the Dominion. But where was the Dominion when my father's ship burned? Where was the Dominion when I was left for dead?" The leader hesitated. It was enough. A gunshot cracked through the night. Rhoan's men surged forward. The battle reignited. Nyx turned, cutting through the nearest soldier before he could react. Rhoan was beside her in an instant, his rifle blazing. Within minutes, the rebels were in retreat. The war, at least for tonight, was over. And she was still standing. Later, in the quiet aftermath of the battle, Nyx sat across from Rhoan, firelight casting sharp shadows over his scarred features. "You didn't have to do that," he said. She studied him, golden eyes unblinking. "Neither did you." A pause. Then he reached out. His fingers brushed her wrist, barely a touch, yet deliberate. Nyx didn't pull away. For the first time, she didn't want to. Outside the cave, the wind howled, carrying the scent of rain and scorched earth. The remnants of battle still clung to the camp like a ghost, the distant crackling of smoldering wreckage a stark reminder of how close death had come. But here, in the flickering firelight, it was only the two of them. Nyx sat with her back against the uneven rock wall, legs crossed, posture deceptively relaxed. Across from her, Dain Rhoan leaned forward, his arms resting on his knees, his gray eyes never leaving hers. The silence between them was heavy, not uncomfortable, but weighted with something neither of them was willing to name. She could still feel the ghost of his touch against her wrist. A whisper of warmth, gone too soon. "You never answered me," he finally said. Nyx tilted her head slightly, feigning disinterest. "About what?" Rhoan's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Why you didn't run." She could have given a dozen different answers. None of them would have been entirely true. So instead, she leaned forward just slightly, letting the firelight carve shadows across her sharp features. "Because I don't know what I am without them." She had meant the Dominion, but she wasn't sure if that was the truth anymore. Rhoan's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze did. A flicker of understanding. Recognition. "Then what are you now?" Nyx exhaled slowly. "Untethered." The words settled between them, solid and immovable. Rhoan nodded once, as if he had expected that answer. "I know the feeling." Another silence. This one more fragile than the last. Outside, the storm was building. Inside, something else was brewing. Nyx studied him, the way the firelight caught on the silvering at his temples, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. He had lived longer than most soldiers did, survived battles that should have killed him. And yet here he was, sitting across from her, watching her as if she was the puzzle he couldn't solve. That should have unsettled her. It didn't. "You were willing to die for me today," she said suddenly, voice quieter than she intended. Rhoan's expression darkened. It wasn't a conscious decision. Nyx arched a brow. "That doesn't make it better." "No, I suppose it doesn't." A muscle in his jaw twitched, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked uneasy. Not in the way of a man who feared battle or death, but in the way of a man who had done something reckless without understanding why. Nyx shifted slightly, letting the fire's warmth sink into her bones. "If you do that again," she said, "I won't forgive you." Rhoan blinked. "For saving your life. For throwing yours away for mine." Something flickered behind his eyes, something unspoken, something dangerous. "You think I regret it?" he asked, voice low. Nyx held his gaze. "I think you don't know why you did it. And that's worse." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, to her surprise, he let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Damn Dominion. You don't let a man have his own mistakes, do you?" Nyx smirked. "Not when they're stupid mistakes." Rhoan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He looked tired, not in the way a soldier looks after battle, but in the way a man does when the ground beneath his feet has started to shift. "Get some sleep, Veyne," he muttered. She didn't move. Neither did he. Neither of them did. And the storm outside raged on. Rhoan woke with a blade at his throat. Instinct took over before thought could. He moved, rolling off the cot, the knife slicing through the air where his neck had been. His attacker lunged again, but Rhoan was faster. He caught the soldier's wrist, twisted, slammed the man into the cave wall. A struggle. A gasp. Then stillness. Rhoan tightened his grip. His vision adjusted to the dim light, and he finally saw who it was. Joran. One of his own. The betrayal burned hotter than the fight itself. What the hell do you think you're doing? Rhoan growled. Joran bared his teeth, struggling against the hold. What I should have done the moment you freed that alien. A sharp intake of breath. Rhoan didn't have to turn to know Nyx was awake. She was watching. Joran spat blood onto the cave floor, his face twisted with rage. You let her live. You let her stay. And now you let her into your bed. Rhoan's fingers twitched against the soldier's wrist. His pulse pounded in his ears. Behind him, Nyx remained still. Too still. Joran sneered. You think the men don't see it? You think they aren't talking? You chose her over us. Silence stretched. Then, Rhoan let go. Joran staggered back, rubbing his wrist, his eyes burning with disgust. But he didn't attack again. Leave, Rhoan said, voice steel. Joran scoffed. You don't get it, do you? This isn't just me. The men talk, Captain. They see what you're doing. She's Dominion. She's the enemy. And no matter how deep you bury yourself between her legs, that won't change. The rage that surged inside Rhoan was swift and absolute. He could end this man right now. But he didn't. Because Joran wasn't wrong. He took a slow breath. Get out. Joran hesitated, waiting for Rhoan to snap, to give the kill order. It never came. With a sneer, he turned and stalked out of the cave, vanishing into the night. The silence left behind was suffocating. Rhoan turned slowly. Nyx stood near the entrance, wrapped in the blanket from his cot. The firelight carved sharp shadows across her face, but her golden eyes burned with something unreadable. She didn't move. She didn't speak. But she didn't need to. Rhoan knew what she was thinking. Finally, she exhaled. How many more of them want me dead? Rhoan clenched his jaw. I don't know. Nyx tilted her head, studying him. Then you do know. He ran a hand through his hair. It doesn't matter. A dry, humorless laugh escaped her lips. It doesn't matter? She stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Half your men would slit my throat given the chance. And it doesn't matter? Rhoan held her gaze. I'll handle it. Nyx's jaw tightened. You can't handle this, Rhoan. You can't order loyalty. You can't change what I am to them. Something cracked in her voice at the last part. Rhoan stepped closer. And what are you? She didn't answer. Because for the first time, she didn't know. Her entire life had been dictated by the Dominion. What she was. Who she was. Where she belonged. But the moment she had chosen to fight against them, that certainty had shattered. She was no longer Dominion. But she wasn't human, either. She was something else. Something undefined. And it terrified her. The night stretched on, thick with the weight of unspoken words. Nyx stood unmoving, wrapped in Rhoan's blanket, the firelight licking across her violet skin. Her golden eyes burned with something unreadable, something she wasn't ready to name. Rhoan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. The echoes of Joran's words still clung to the air like smoke. She's the enemy. You chose her over us. The worst part? He didn't regret it. You should go, she said suddenly, voice flat. Rhoan's jaw tightened. Not happening. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Your men will turn on you if you keep protecting me. Let them. Nyx huffed a humorless laugh, shaking her head. And what happens when one of them puts a blade in your back while you sleep? Then I'll make sure they regret it. You can't fight an entire army alone, Rhoan. Watch me. A muscle in her jaw twitched. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackling fire and the distant murmur of the camp outside. Nyx inhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. Why are you doing this? Rhoan stared at her. He could have given a dozen different answers. The war. The alliance they had forged on the battlefield. The fact that she was too valuable to lose. But none of those were true. Instead, he said the only thing that mattered. Because I want to. Something flickered behind her eyes. Anger, confusion, something else. She stepped closer. You don't even know me. I know enough. She searched his face, looking for a lie. She wouldn't find one. You're a fool, Captain, she murmured. Rhoan smirked. I've been called worse. Nyx exhaled sharply, running a hand through her tangled green hair. If I stay, you'll be fighting your own people. The war won't end. Rhoan's smirk faded. The war was never going to end, Nyx. Not really. That was the truth neither of them wanted to say aloud. The Dominion wouldn't stop hunting her. And now, neither would his own people. They weren't on opposite sides anymore. They were standing on their own. Alone. Together, Nyx let out a slow breath, staring into the fire. "If I stay," she said, "we have to be ready." Rhoan nodded. "We will be." A pause. Then, quietly, she said, "You shouldn't have saved me." Rhoan stepped closer, his voice low. "I'd do it again." She looked up at him, her golden eyes sharp and wary. Like she wanted to believe him, like she was afraid to. But she didn't pull away. And Rhoan knew then. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was war. And he wasn't about to lose. The morning brought no peace. By the time the sun crested the horizon, tension had settled over the camp like a storm waiting to break. Rhoan could feel it in the way his soldiers moved. Quick, precise, but wary. They avoided Nyx, whispered when they thought he wasn't listening. He caught the glances, the tightened grips on weapons. Jorn had been right about one thing. They weren't just questioning him. They were waiting for an excuse. Nyx stood at the edge of the camp, arms crossed, watching the soldiers train. If the hostility bothered her, she didn't show it. But Rhoan knew better. She was too still, too quiet. "How bad is it?" she asked without turning. Rhoan exhaled. "Bad." She smirked, but there was no humor in it. "You're not good at sugarcoating things, are you?" "Never saw the point." Nyx nodded, watching as a group of soldiers sparred with dull training blades. She tilted her head slightly. They fight with too much weight in their stance. Dominion warriors move differently. More precision, more control. She paused. "You're strong. You endure. But you waste too much energy." Rhoan smirked. "Sounds like an insult." "An observation." His gaze flicked to her. "Show me." Nyx finally looked at him, brow arching. "You want me to train your men? They're going to have to trust you eventually." Nyx studied him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she stepped forward, drawing the knife from her belt. The soldiers noticed immediately. Their training stopped. Their conversations died. They watched as Nyx approached the sparring circle, rolling her shoulders. "Who's first?" she asked. Silence. Then, one of the soldiers, tall, broad-shouldered, with a wary expression, stepped forward. He drew his training blade, holding it in a standard stance. Nyx sighed. Too rigid. The soldier's eyes narrowed. "You think you can beat me?" Nyx twirled the knife in her hand, smirking. "I think I can embarrass you." The man lunged. Nyx moved faster. A twist, a shift of weight. Before the soldier could react, she had his arm locked, his blade twisted from his grip, and him on his knees. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Rhoan crossed his arms, watching with amusement. "You going easy on them?" Nyx smirked. Wouldn't want to break them too fast. But Rhoan could see it, the way the soldiers were watching her now. Not as an enemy, but as something else. A weapon. A threat. A leader. The tide was shifting, and not everyone would like it. That night, it happened again. Rhoan woke to the sound of movement. Not loud, not careless, but not careful enough. He shifted just slightly, keeping his breathing even, his body still. He knew the feel of a blade in the dark. He had felt it before. A shadow moved in the corner of his tent. Another betrayal. Rhoan moved fast. The moment the attacker struck, he was already countering, grabbing the wrist, twisting, slamming the figure to the ground. A struggle, a choked gasp, and then a gunshot. Rhoan barely had time to register the noise before the body beneath him slumped. Blood, not his. His head snapped up. Nyx stood in the entrance, her blaster raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Her golden eyes burned in the darkness. She stepped closer, gaze flicking to the dead man at his feet. Then she met Rhoan's eyes. "You were too slow." Rhoan exhaled. "You were faster." Nyx tilted her head. "Told you I was better." He smirked despite himself. "I'm starting to believe it." She studied him for a long moment, then holstered her weapon. Rhoan looked down at the corpse. The second soldier to betray him in 2 nights. They were running out of time. Nyx turned, glancing over her shoulder. "You still think they'll trust me?" Rhoan sighed. "They don't have a choice." And neither did he. The war inside the camp had begun, and it was only a matter of time before the next blade came. Morning came with the sharp bite of tension, thick and clinging like the scent of blood from the night before. Rhoan stood at the edge of the camp, hands braced on the railing of the command outpost, staring out over the barren landscape. The twin suns had barely crested the horizon, casting long shadows across the jagged rocks and scorched earth. The remnants of yesterday's battle still lingered, wreckage scattered across the valley, Dominion bodies lying where they had fallen. His men were quiet. Too quiet. The second assassination attempt had shattered what little illusion of control he had left. Now, they weren't just questioning his leadership. They were waiting, watching, for him to make a mistake, for a reason to take matters into their own hands. You need to address them. Rhoan didn't turn. He didn't have to. Nyx stood just behind him, arms crossed, her golden eyes flickering in the morning light. The wind caught the ends of her green hair, pulling it loose from where she had braided it. She was still wearing the blood-stained gear from the night before, the same worn fabric she had slept in, if she had slept at all. He exhaled. If I call a meeting now, I'll be giving them the opportunity they want. To kill you, to challenge me. Nyx made a low sound in the back of her throat, half amusement, half frustration. And what happens when the next one tries to slit your throat in your sleep? Rhoan finally turned to face her. You're awfully concerned about my well-being, Dominion. Nyx narrowed her eyes. Don't mistake practicality for concern. I just don't want to deal with the mess if they kill you before we make a real plan. His lips quirked into a humorless smirk. Right? Of course. But he saw the way she was gripping her arms just a little too tightly, her weight shifting slightly, as if she was holding herself back from pacing. She wasn't as indifferent as she wanted to be, and that was dangerous. For both of them. By midday, the confrontation was inevitable. Rhoan stood before his gathered soldiers, the sun burning high overhead, his expression unreadable. The men were tense, standing in tight clusters, some with their hands resting lightly on their weapons. The air was thick with barely restrained hostility. This wasn't just a meeting. This was a test. Nyx stood off to the side, arms still crossed, but her gaze was sharp, assessing, calculating. She was watching the way the men moved, the way their bodies leaned ever so slightly toward one another, watching who was tense, who was eager, who was waiting for blood to spill. Rhoan let the silence stretch before he finally spoke. 2 men are dead, he said. Not in battle. Not by Dominion hands. His gaze swept over them, cold and unflinching. But because they thought I could no longer be trusted. A murmur rippled through the crowd. They were right, someone muttered. Rhoan's eyes snapped to the voice. Joran. The man hadn't fled after the last attempt. No, he had stayed. And now, he was stepping forward, shoulders squared, jaw clenched. You claim to lead us, Joran said, voice steady. But we see where your loyalties lie. He turned slightly, eyes flicking toward Nyx with barely disguised contempt. You keep the enemy at your side. You fight for her instead of us. Nyx raised a brow. Funny, she mused. I seem to recall saving your captain's life last night. And the night before. Joran's face twisted with disgust. I'd rather he be dead than in bed with a Dominion whore. The words barely left his mouth before Rhoan moved. 1 second, he was standing still. The next, he had Joran by the collar, yanking him forward before slamming a fist into his gut. The impact sent Joran staggering back, gasping for breath. The camp went silent. Deadly. Waiting. Rhoan's voice was low, dangerous. Say that again. Joran spat blood onto the dirt. His hands balled into fists. You can't see it, can you? His voice was hoarse, but steady. She's not one of us. She never will be. And as long as she stands beside you, neither are you. Rhoan exhaled slowly. His knuckles ached from the force of the hit, but he kept his expression unreadable. He knew what was happening here. This wasn't just about Nyx. This was about power, control. Joran wasn't looking for justice. He was looking for an opening, for a chance to take command, for a chance to kill him. Rhoan glanced at Nyx. She hadn't moved. Her expression hadn't changed, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers twitched ever so slightly near the hilt of her blade. She was waiting to see how this played out. She was waiting to see if he was still worth following. Rhoan turned back to Joran. If you want me dead, he said, voice dangerously calm, you'd better do it now. Joran hesitated. It was the last mistake he ever made. Rhoan struck first. A sharp, brutal movement. A single fluid motion. Joran barely had time to react before Rhoan had his knife against his throat, pressing just hard enough to break skin. The silence was deafening. Joran's breathing was ragged, his pulse hammering against the blade. Rhoan held him there for a long moment. Long enough for the others to see. Long enough for them to understand. Then, without a word, he let go. Joran stumbled back, hand flying to his throat. His gaze flickered between Rhoan and Nyx, something wild and uncertain lurking beneath his rage. But he didn't attack again, because he knew now. He had lost. Rhoan stepped back, sheathing his blade. He turned to the rest of the soldiers. If anyone else has something to say, speak now. No one moved. No one breathed. Then, one by one, they stepped back. The fight was over. For now. The camp was quieter that night. Not peaceful, but quiet. Nyx sat near the fire, sharpening her blade. The rhythmic scrape of metal against stone was the only sound between them. Rhoan watched her for a moment before finally speaking. You didn't step in today. Nyx didn't look up. Didn't need to. Rhoan leaned back, exhaling. You were waiting to see if I could handle it. Now, she glanced up. Her golden eyes flickered with something unreadable. Would it have mattered if I was? He smirked. Probably not. Nyx smirked back, just slightly, before turning back to her knife. Then there's your answer. Rhoan exhaled, rubbing his jaw. They'll still come for you. Nyx shrugged. They'll come for you first. He huffed a quiet laugh. Comforting. Silence stretched between them. Then, without looking up, Nyx said, You don't have to keep fighting for me. Rhoan didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached forward, taking the blade from her hands. She blinked, looking at him, startled. Slowly, he turned the weapon over in his grip. You don't have to keep fighting alone. Nyx held his gaze. A long beat. Then she smirked. You're an idiot. Rhoan smirked back. You're just now figuring that out? She huffed a quiet laugh. And for the first time in weeks, the tension between them didn't feel like war. It felt like something else. Something just as dangerous. Something neither of them were ready for. The stars burned cold above them. Nyx sat perched on the edge of a rusted supply crate, her gaze fixed on the endless black sky beyond the camp. The fire had long since died down, but she hadn't moved. She could feel him watching her. You don't sleep much, Rhoan's voice cut through the quiet. Nyx didn't look at him. Never needed much of it. Rhoan leaned against a nearby support beam, arms crossed over his chest. That a Dominion thing? A ghost of a smirk. That's a survivor thing. Silence stretched between them, thin as wire. The camp had been still for hours, but beneath the quiet, tension coiled like a loaded weapon. The soldiers weren't happy, even if they had backed down. Their resentment didn't die with Joran's defeat. It festered. Nyx had seen it before. The slow, simmering kind of hatred that didn't erupt immediately, but waited, patient and cold. She turned slightly, glancing at Rhoan. His face was unreadable, but his fingers tapped absently against his forearm, the only sign of unease. You know they're going to try again, she said. I know. Nyx studied him for a moment. And what's your plan when they do? Rhoan exhaled sharply. Haven't decided yet. That's unlike you. His lips quirked into something that wasn't quite a smile. You don't know me that well, Dominion. Nyx tilted her head. I know you well enough. Something flickered behind his eyes. A shadow of something deeper. You think I'm reckless, he said. I think you're stubborn, she corrected. And stubborn men get themselves killed. Rhoan huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. That's supposed to be advice? Nyx shrugged. Take it however you want. Another silence. Then, without looking at him, she said, You can't stay here. Rhoan's expression darkened. This is my camp. Not anymore. His jaw tightened. I built this unit from nothing. These men are ready to turn on you. She interrupted, voice cold. And you know it. Rhoan exhaled slowly. He did know it. She could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, in the way he carried himself now, like a man bracing for the inevitable. Finally, he met her gaze. And what do you suggest? Nyx smirked. We leave. Rhoan arched a brow. We? Nyx leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. I don't have a side anymore, Captain. Her voice was quiet but sharp. Neither do you. Rhoan studied her. He should have argued. Should have told her she was wrong. That he could salvage what was left of his command. That this was just another challenge to be crushed beneath his boot. But he didn't. Because deep down, he knew the truth. The war wasn't over. But the fight here? That was lost. Where do we go? He asked. Nyx exhaled, standing up. We steal a ship. Rhoan blinked. Bold. She grinned. You like bold. His smirk mirrored hers. That I do. Leaving wouldn't be easy. The soldiers might have stepped back during the confrontation with Joran, but that didn't mean they were loyal. Rhoan's authority was paper-thin, and now that blood had been spilled, it was only a matter of time before the next knife came. They had a window. A small one. Nyx had spent the morning gathering intel, moving through the camp like a ghost. Listening. Watching. She was good at going unnoticed when she wanted to be. It was a skill the Dominion had drilled into her from childhood, how to be present without being seen. She returned to the tent at midday, slipping inside with silent steps. Rhoan was waiting, arms crossed. Well, Nyx smirked. I found us a ship. He arched a brow. That fast. Your security is shit. Rhoan exhaled, shaking his head. You really know how to boost a man's confidence. Nyx tossed a small data chip onto the table between them. Docked at the East Ridge. Unmanned. We can be in the air within an hour. Rhoan picked up the chip, rolling it between his fingers. And the men? Nyx shrugged. Some of them will try to stop us. Rhoan's gaze darkened. Then we'll deal with it. A beat of silence. Then, quietly, Nyx said, You know once we leave, there's no going back. Rhoan met her eyes. We left the moment we started this, Nyx. She nodded once. And just like that, the decision was made. They moved at night. The ship sat perched on the East Ridge, just as Nyx had said. Sleek, compact, built for speed. Not a warship, but fast enough to outrun one. Getting there wasn't the hard part. Leaving was. The first shot rang out just as they reached the loading ramp. Nyx ducked instinctively, twisting just in time to see the soldiers emerging from the shadows, weapons raised. Rhoan cursed. Should have known they'd be watching. Nyx smirked, drawing her blade. I was hoping for a warm send-off. Rhoan fired first. The camp exploded into chaos. Nyx moved like liquid shadow, cutting through the soldiers before they had time to react. She wasn't Dominion anymore, but she fought like she still was. Precision. Efficiency. No wasted movement. Rhoan covered her, his rifle spitting fire into the dark. They moved in sync, a dance forged in battle, until the last of the resistance fell. Then, silence. The ship loomed before them. Rhoan turned to her. Last chance to change your mind. Nyx grinned, stepping onto the ramp. Not a chance. He followed. The ship's engines roared to life. And just like that, they were gone. The stars stretched endless before them, a sea of silver against the deep black of space. Nyx stood at the viewport, arms crossed, watching the world they had left behind shrink into the abyss. Rhoan approached, stopping beside her. Regrets? He asked. She exhaled. Not yet. A beat of silence. Then, what now? Nyx turned to him, a slow, dangerous smile curling at the edges of her lips. Now. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a low murmur. We build something new. Rhoan smirked. Sounds like trouble. Nyx's golden eyes gleamed. You have no idea. And with that, they set a course for nowhere. For the first time in their lives, they were free. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound in the cockpit. Nyx sat in the co-pilot's chair, legs crossed, absently spinning a blade between her fingers. The weapon caught the dim light, glinting with each slow rotation. She wasn't thinking about the blade, though. She was thinking about where they were going. Because for the first time in her life, she didn't know. Her entire existence had been mapped out from birth. Every battle, every victory, every loss. Even her capture had been another chapter in a war that had never truly belonged to her. But this was the unknown, and she wasn't sure if she hated it or if she craved it. Rhoan sat beside her, one hand resting on the ship's controls, the other drumming against the armrest. His gaze was fixed on the swirling void of hyperspace, but Nyx could tell his mind was elsewhere. You look like a man trying too hard not to think, she said. Rhoan huffed a quiet laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. You ever realize you've spent so much time fighting that you don't know what to do when the fight's over? Nyx smirked, flicking her blade into its sheath. You're assuming the fight is over. Rhoan turned to her, brow arching. It's not. She shook her head. Not for people like us. He studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, exhaling. All right then, what's our next fight? Nyx tapped the side of the console, pulling up a star map. The glowing display flickered to life, countless systems stretching before them. Some familiar, some she had only ever seen in Dominion intelligence reports. She traced a finger over one of the outer rim systems. Here, she said. Rhoan leaned forward, frowning at the name that flashed on the screen. Veritas. Nyx nodded. Neutral territory. Not under Dominion control. Not under human jurisdiction either. No military presence. It's a safe place to lay low. For how long? Nyx smirked. Depends how good you are at staying unnoticed. Rhoan sighed, shaking his head. I've never been good at that. Then I'll teach you. Something flickered in his eyes. Amusement. Curiosity. Maybe something else. Fine, he muttered. We'll go to Veritas. He turned back to the controls, inputting the coordinates. But if we get shot at within the first 5 minutes of landing, I'm blaming you. Nyx grinned. Wouldn't have it any other way. The planet loomed before them, a world of jagged mountains and sprawling cityscapes wrapped in an endless storm. Thick clouds churned over the atmosphere, flickering with bursts of violet lightning. Rhoan frowned. You sure this place is safe? Nyx smirked. Define safe. He shot her a look. You are absolutely insufferable. I prefer adaptable. The ship's automated landing sequence engaged, guiding them toward a sprawling settlement built into the side of a canyon. Neon lights flickered along the edges of the buildings, casting eerie reflections against the storm-dark sky. Rhoan exhaled. All right. We land. We get supplies. We figure out what the hell we're doing next. Nyx arched a brow. That sounded dangerously close to a plan, Captain. Don't get used to it, he muttered, flicking a switch. Plans tend to go to hell when you're around. She smirked. That's what makes them fun. Chapter 18. The Ghost Market. The city pulsed with life. They moved through the winding streets, past traders hawking their wares, exotic weapons, stolen tech, vials of substances Nyx didn't bother identifying. This was a place of secrets, a place where fugitives and war criminals could disappear. It was exactly what they needed. Rhoan kept his hand near his weapon, his gaze sharp. Nyx walked beside him, moving like she belonged, like the narrow alleys and flickering neon lights were as familiar as a battlefield. You've been here before, Rhoan noted. Nyx didn't answer immediately. Her gaze flicked to a passing vendor, noting the Dominion insignia etched into the hilt of a blade. Stolen. Or smuggled. Probably both. Once, she said finally. A long time ago. Rhoan studied her. Before or after you became the Dominion's heir? Nyx's smirk was thin. Does it matter? He held her gaze for a moment, then let it go. They reached the central market, a sprawling, half-ruined structure carved into the bones of an ancient shipwreck. Rusted hull pieces jutted from the earth like ribs, and the stalls were nestled between the metal remains. A place built from the remnants of war. Fitting. Nyx scanned the crowd. She had contacts here. Or at least, she used to. Then she saw him. A man leaning against a broken pillar, arms crossed, his dark eyes flickering with recognition the moment they locked onto hers. Nyx exhaled. Stay here. Rhoan arched a brow. Not a chance. Nyx rolled her eyes. Fine. Just let me handle this. She approached the man, her posture relaxed but deliberate. Varos, she said smoothly. Varos smirked. Nyx Veyne. Alive and still causing trouble, I see. She tilted her head. You expected otherwise? Varos chuckled. With the Dominion hunting you? I expected to be selling pieces of you by now. Rhoan tensed beside her, but Nyx placed a light hand against his arm. A silent warning. Varos noticed. His gaze flicked between them, curiosity sparking. And who's this? Nyx smirked. A business partner. Varos' grin widened. Is that what they're calling it now? Rhoan exhaled sharply. We need supplies. Weapons. And information. Varos scratched his chin. Information's expensive. So is loyalty, Nyx said smoothly. And I remember a time when you owed me. Varos chuckled. Fair enough. What do you want to know? Nyx's golden eyes gleamed. The Dominion. The humans. Who's coming for us? Varos' expression sobered slightly. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. You're not gonna like the answer. Nyx's pulse quickened. Try me. Varos glanced around, then leaned in. Word is, there's a bounty out for you. Not just from the Dominion. The humans too. Rhoan stiffened. They want her dead? Varos shook his head. No. They want her brought in. Alive. Nyx's jaw tightened. Rhoan frowned. Why? Varos hesitated. Because they don't think she's a fugitive. He met Nyx's gaze. They think she's a defector. Silence. Then, Nyx exhaled sharply. Well, she murmured, that complicates things. They left the market as quickly as they had come, slipping into the shadows of the city. Rhoan was silent. Too silent. Nyx finally glanced at him. Say it. Rhoan exhaled through his nose. They're hunting you. They've always been hunting me. He shook his head. This is different, Nyx. The Dominion wants you dead. The humans want you theirs. Nyx smirked, but there was no real amusement behind it. Didn't know I was so popular. Nyx? She stopped, turning to face him fully. What do you want me to say, Rhoan? Her voice was quiet, sharp. That I didn't see this coming? That I don't know how this ends? Rhoan's jaw tightened. I don't like being hunted. Then we don't let them catch us. A beat of silence. Then, slowly, Rhoan nodded. All right, he murmured. We do this your way. Nyx grinned. Good, she said. Now let's go steal another ship. The ship was waiting for them on the far side of the city, a sleek, Dominion-built cruiser tucked away in the ruins of an abandoned outpost. It wouldn't be easy to take, but nothing ever was. Nyx crouched behind a rusted support beam, scanning the perimeter. A handful of guards patrolled the landing bay, their weapons slung loosely over their shoulders. Not Dominion. Not human. Mercenaries. Hard guns with no real loyalty beyond their next paycheck. Rhoan knelt beside her, eyes narrowed. You have a plan? Nyx smirked. Of course. Rhoan exhaled. I hate that look. You love this look. That's debatable. Nyx rolled her shoulders. We go quiet. Take out the sentries first. Then we move fast. Rhoan arched a brow. You always this confident? Nyx unsheathed her blade, golden eyes gleaming. I don't believe in failure, Rhoan. And then she moved. They struck like shadows, slipping through the cracks in the mercenaries' defenses before they even realized the fight had begun. Nyx moved with lethal precision, taking down the first guard with a swift, silent cut. Rhoan was right behind her, his pistol firing in quick, controlled bursts. By the time the last mercenary hit the ground, the ramp to the cruiser was already lowering. Nyx smirked. See? Easy. Rhoan huffed a laugh, holstering his weapon. Remind me to never bet against you. They sprinted up the ramp, sealing the hatch behind them. The ship hummed beneath their feet, the familiar glow of Dominion tech pulsing along the walls. Nyx slid into the pilot's chair, fingers dancing over the controls. The engines roared to life, and the ship trembled as it powered up. Hold on, she murmured. The cruiser shot skyward, cutting through the thick storm clouds above Verithis. Below them, alarms blared, red warning lights flashing across the city. They had been seen. Didn't matter. They were already gone. The stars stretched endless before them, the weight of Verithis falling away behind them. Rhoan stood at the viewport, arms crossed, watching the planet shrink into the void. Nyx leaned back in the pilot's chair, exhaling. You good? Rhoan didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, he said, They're not going to stop coming, Nyx. She nodded. I know. Rhoan turned to her. So what do we do? Nyx's smirk was sharp, dangerous. We give them a reason to be afraid. His brow arched. And how do we do that? She gestured to the ship around them. This is Dominion tech. High-end. Probably has fleet access codes buried somewhere in its system. She tapped the console. If we can crack them, we won't just be running. We'll be watching. Rhoan's expression shifted. You want to fight back? Nyx tilted her head. I want to stop running. Rhoan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. You know this means war, right? Nyx leaned forward, golden eyes locked onto his. Rhoan, the war never ended. We just picked the wrong sides. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, let's burn them all down. They worked quickly, stripping the ship of its old identity, erasing its Dominion markings, rewriting its codes. Nyx found the access logs buried deep in the system, encrypted Dominion communications, fleet routes, classified intelligence. It was everything they needed, everything they could use. Rhoan leaned over her shoulder, watching as she decrypted the files. So where do we hit first? Nyx grinned, flicking through the data. There's a Dominion outpost not far from here. Small, lightly defended, but valuable. Rhoan smirked. Sounds like a good start. Nyx's fingers hovered over the controls, hesitating for just a fraction of a second. Then she turned to him. You sure about this? Rhoan exhaled. I was never sure about anything until now. That was enough. Nyx entered the coordinates, and the ship's engines roared to life. The stars blurred around them as they jumped to hyperspace, leaving everything behind. No masters. No chains. Only the war they would wage on their own terms. And for the first time, Nyx wasn't fighting for an empire. She was fighting for herself. And for him. They called them traitors. Rebels. Ghosts. Stories spread across the galaxy of a stolen Dominion warship, striking from the shadows, vanishing into the dark. A captain and his Dominion-born warrior, carving their own path, defying the empires that had tried to own them. The Dominion wanted them dead. The humans wanted them captured. Neither would get what they wanted, because Nyx Veyne and Dain Rhoan had already won. They were free, and no one would ever take that from them again. The end.